Dust motes danced in the beam of her dying flashlight as the massive steel door slammed shut, the echo reverberating through the concrete abyss. $27. That was all it cost to buy her own tomb. Chloe thought she was bidding on discarded furniture left by a forgotten tenant. Instead, she had purchased the buried sins of Richard Harrington, a man whose corporate empire stretched across 3 continents. Now, with the oxygen scrubbers winding down and heavy footsteps echoing in the dark corridor ahead, she finally realized the true, terrifying price of her winning bid. Rain lashed against the corrugated tin roof of the ironclad storage facility, sounding like a handful of gravel thrown against a hollow drum. Chloe Bennett pulled the collar of her damp trench coat tighter around her neck, shivering as the damp chill of a miserable November morning seeped into her bones. She clutched a crumpled paper cup of bitter gas station coffee, her eyes scanning the small group of professional scavengers gathered in the dingy hallway. They were a hardened crew, men and women, who made their living picking like vultures through the abandoned debris of failed marriages, foreclosed businesses, and sudden deaths. Chloe didn't belong here. 6 months ago, she was a mid-level financial auditor at a respectable firm in downtown Chicago. Then came her younger sister's aggressive leukemia diagnosis, the denial of insurance coverage by a faceless corporate board, and the rapid, terrifying depletion of Chloe's entire life savings. Now, she was surviving on instant noodles and the desperate hope that she could flip forgotten junk on internet auction sites to make next month's rent and her sister's copays. All right, listen up, you scavengers, barked Dale, the facility manager. He was a mountain of a man with a stained baseball cap and a clipboard that looked tiny in his massive hands. Unit 404. Rent hasn't been paid in 3 years. We cut the lock. We open the door. You get 30 seconds to look from the threshold. No touching. No stepping inside. You bid on the whole lot. Highest bidder takes the garbage. Dale raised a heavy pair of bolt cutters and snapped the rusted master lock with a sharp crack. He hauled the roll-up door open. A collective groan rippled through the small crowd. Unit 404 was a disaster. It didn't hold the promise of forgotten antiques or mislaid electronics. The 10x10 space was dominated by a sagging, mold-spotted canvas tarp covering what looked like a pile of broken wooden pallets and rusted iron pipes. The air that wafted out smelled of mildew, stagnant water, and decaying cardboard. Looks like a homeless encampment, muttered a regular named Stan, turning away in disgust. I pass. Come on, folks, Dale urged, though his tone was flat. I need this unit cleared by tomorrow. Bidding starts at $50. Silence. 40? Dale tried. Chloe leaned in, narrowing her eyes. Underneath the edge of the heavy moldy tarp, mostly obscured by a shattered crate, she spotted a distinctive matte black corner. It was reinforced with heavy-duty polymer resin and featured a brushed steel latch. It was a Pelican protective case, the kind used by professional photographers, military contractors, and surveyors to transport highly sensitive, expensive equipment. The case alone, even empty, retailed for nearly $300. If there was something inside it, it could cover her sister's medication for a month. 20, Chloe called out, her voice trembling slightly. Dale sighed. I got 20. Do I hear 30? The other regulars were already walking away, checking their phones or lighting cigarettes. They saw nothing but a trip to the local landfill, which would cost them more in dumping fees than the junk was worth. 25. Stan suddenly grunted, tossing a half-smoked cigarette onto the wet concrete. He had seen her looking and figured she spotted something he missed. Chloe's heart pounded. She reached into her pocket. She had exactly $29 in physical cash. 27, she said, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. And I'll have it cleared out by sunset. Stan looked at the pile of rusted pipes, then at Chloe's desperate posture. He sneered. Have fun at the dump, sweetheart. All yours. Sold to the lady in the wet coat for $27, Dale muttered, scribbling on his clipboard. Pay at the office. You have until 6 p.m. to empty it out. 2 hours later, armed with heavy leather work gloves and a crowbar, Chloe began the grueling task of dragging the debris out of Unit 404. The pipes were heavy and covered in a thick layer of orange rust, leaving her clothes stained and her muscles aching. She dragged the rotting pallets to the facility's dumpster, her anticipation building. Finally, she pulled back the heavy, foul-smelling canvas tarp. The Pelican case was there. It was larger than she had initially thought, a massive model meant for server racks or heavy armaments. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, suggesting it had been sitting there long before the rent stopped being paid. Chloe wiped the grime away, searching for a label. There was only a faded barcode and a heavily worn sticker that sent a sudden, icy jolt down her spine. The sticker bore a stylized insignia, a silver falcon clutching a globe, and underneath it, the bold lettering Harrington Logistics. Chloe froze. Everyone in the financial world, and most people who watched the evening news, knew the name Richard Harrington. He was a billionaire industrialist, a genius who had revolutionized global supply chains using proprietary algorithms. But 3 years ago, his empire collapsed overnight amidst allegations of massive fraud, illegal weapons trafficking, and the embezzlement of over $2 billion from his own company's pension fund. Before federal agents could raid his Manhattan penthouse, Harrington vanished. His private jet was found abandoned on a runway in Costa Rica, but Harrington was a ghost. Theories ranged from a cartel assassination to facial reconstruction surgery in Eastern Europe. With trembling fingers, Chloe grabbed her crowbar and jammed it into the heavy steel latches of the Pelican case. The padlocks had been removed, leaving only the built-in catches. She pried them open with a sharp pop. She lifted the lid. There were no diamonds. There was no missing $2 billion. Instead, the case was lined with custom-cut foam housing exactly 3 items: a heavy antique iron skeleton key, a high-end tactical flashlight, and a thick leather-bound ledger. Chloe pulled the ledger out, her breath catching in her throat. She flipped it open. The pages were filled with handwritten coordinates, strings of alphanumeric codes, and complex schematics. Tucked into the front cover was a folded document on heavy, watermarked paper. It was a deed of trust, notarized and stamped. It wasn't for the storage unit. It was for the land directly underneath the storage facility. And the beneficiary listed on the document, signed in dark blue ink, was Richard Harrington. Chloe lowered the paper, staring at the empty concrete floor of the storage unit. She looked at the heavy iron key in her hand, then back at the floor. The rusted pipes and broken pallets hadn't just been junk. They had been camouflage. Chloe turned the tactical flashlight on, its powerful LED beam cutting through the gloom of the storage unit like a physical blade. She walked slowly across the concrete floor, dragging the heavy metal tip of her crowbar along the ground, listening. Scrape, 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 clunk. She paused. The sound had changed. She moved to the back right corner of the unit, directly where the heaviest stack of pallets had been piled. She tapped the concrete with the crowbar. Thud, thud, clang. It wasn't concrete. It was a heavy industrial plate painted and textured to perfectly mimic the surrounding floor. A thick layer of dirt and grease had concealed the seams. Chloe fell to her knees, scrubbing at the grime with her gloved hands. Slowly, the outline of a square hatch emerged, roughly 3 feet by 3 feet. In the center of the hatch was a recessed cavity, hidden under a flat metal disc. She pried the disc up with a screwdriver she'd brought in her toolkit. Beneath it was a heavy, old-fashioned iron lock cylinder, entirely incongruous with modern security systems. It was designed to be immune to electronic hacking, EMP blasts, and digital lockpicks. Chloe pulled the antique skeleton key from her pocket. Her hands were shaking violently now. She was trespassing. She was uncovering the secrets of a man hunted by the FBI, Interpol, and God knows who else. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to walk away, call the police, and claim whatever modest reward might be offered. But a modest reward wouldn't pay for her sister's bone marrow transplant. The ledger in her pocket, the secrets buried here, they were leverage, they were power. She inserted the heavy iron key into the slot. It fit perfectly. She took a deep breath, braced herself, and turned it. The mechanism gave a loud, satisfying thwack that vibrated through the floorboards. Chloe gripped the recessed handle and hauled backward with all her strength. For a terrifying second, the hatch didn't budge. Then, with the groan of rusted hydraulics protesting years of neglect, the heavy steel plate swung upward. A rush of stale, frigid air hit her face, carrying the scent of ozone, machine oil, and dry earth. She aimed her flashlight down into the opening. A spiral staircase made of heavy-gauge steel descended into absolute darkness. The shaft was perfectly smooth concrete, resembling the inside of a missile silo. "Hello?" Chloe called out, her voice swallowed instantly by the depth. Silence. She zipped her trench coat, clipped the flashlight to her belt, and gripped the crowbar tightly in her right hand. Slowly, cautiously, she began to descend. The stairs seemed to go on forever. She counted the rotations. 1, 2, 10, 20. She was at least 50 feet below the surface, far deeper than any standard municipal sewer line or subway tunnel. Finally, her boots hit a solid metal grating. She unclipped her flashlight and swept the beam across the space. Her jaw dropped. She was standing in a massive, cavernous, subterranean bunker. The walls were lined with reinforced steel beams and thick concrete. To her left sat a row of colossal, diesel-powered backup generators, silent and cold. To her right, a bank of high-capacity lithium-ion battery arrays. But it was the center of the room that stole her breath. Enclosed in a pristine, dust-free glass cube was a state-of-the-art server farm. Rows upon rows of black towers, their indicator lights completely dark, stood like silent sentinels. Beyond the glass cube was a living area that looked like it had been violently ripped from a luxury penthouse and dropped into a concrete tomb. There was a genuine Chesterfield leather sofa, a massive mahogany desk, and a wall lined with empty, crushed water bottles and MRE wrappers. This wasn't just a stash house. This was a fallout shelter, a command center. Chloe stepped off the metal grating, her footsteps echoing sharply. She approached the mahogany desk. It was littered with papers, a half-empty bottle of Macallan 25, and a heavy crystal tumbler. Sitting in the center of the desk, gathering dust, was a laptop hooked into a massive multi-monitor array. Beside the laptop sat a stack of black canvas bags. Chloe reached out and unzipped the top one. Her breath hitched. The bag was packed to the brim with tight, banded stacks of $100 bills. Federal Reserve notes. Used, non-sequential. There had to be at least $2 million in this bag alone. And there were 5 bags, $10 million. Cash. Sitting in the dark. Suddenly, a realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. If Harrington had $10 million in cash down here, why didn't he take it with him when he fled? She walked around the desk, shining her light on the floor behind it. Chloe screamed, stumbling backward and dropping her flashlight. The heavy aluminum cylinder clattered against the concrete, the beam spinning wildly before settling on a horrific sight. Lying behind the desk, slumped against a heavy steel safe, was a human skeleton. It was dressed in a bespoke Italian suit that hung loosely off the yellowing bones. On the wrist of the skeletal left hand, a platinum Rolex Daytona caught the light of the flashlight. And in the center of the skull, right between the eye sockets, was a neat, perfectly round hole. A silenced, matte black pistol lay on the floor a few inches from the right hand. Richard Harrington hadn't fled to Costa Rica. He hadn't gotten facial reconstruction surgery. He had come down to his bunker, sealed himself in, and put a bullet in his own head. But why? Chloe fought down the bile rising in her throat. She forced herself to step forward, picking up her flashlight. She needed to leave. She needed to grab one of those canvas bags, climb those stairs, lock the hatch, and disappear. $10 million would save her sister and buy them new identities. She reached for the nearest bag, wrapping her trembling fingers around the heavy canvas handle. Click. The sound was soft, but in the dead silence of the subterranean tomb, it sounded like a cannon shot. Whir. Behind the glass walls of the server room, a single green light blinked on. Then another, then a dozen. A low, bass-heavy hum began to vibrate through the concrete floor. The automated systems were booting up. Chloe froze. She hadn't touched the servers. She hadn't touched the power grid. Above her, from the top of the dark shaft, came a sound that made her blood run ice cold. It was the loud, metallic shriek of the heavy steel hatch scraping across the concrete floor. Clang. The hatch slammed shut, sealing the shaft. Clack, clack. The distinct, heavy sound of an external deadbolt sliding into place echoed down the metal cylinder. Chloe dropped the bag of money and sprinted for the stairs. She bounded up the iron steps, 2 at a time, her lungs burning, her legs screaming. She reached the top of the shaft and shoved her hands against the bottom of the steel hatch, pushing with every ounce of strength she possessed. It didn't move a fraction of an inch. She was locked in. "Hey!" Chloe screamed, hammering her fists against the cold steel of the hatch. "Hey! Is someone up there? Let me out! Help!" The only answer was the dull, muffled thud of her own fists. The concrete silo absorbed her panic, reflecting it back as a hollow, pathetic echo. She stepped back, her chest heaving, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. She was trapped 50 feet underground with a dead billionaire, surrounded by millions of dollars she could no longer spend. She descended the spiral staircase slowly, her mind racing, analyzing the situation with the cold, Detached logic she used to apply to hostile corporate takeovers. The hatch had been locked from the outside. That meant someone else had the key, or someone else had breached the facility. The automated systems had booted up right before the hatch closed. A proximity sensor? A silent alarm triggered when she opened the trap door? She reached the bottom of the stairs and looked toward the glass server room. The green lights were pulsing steadily now. On the mahogany desk, the array of monitors suddenly flickered to life, casting a harsh, blue-white glow over the skeletal remains of Richard Harrington. Chloe approached the desk cautiously. She placed her crowbar on the leather surface and leaned over the keyboard. The screen wasn't asking for a password. It was displaying a live feed from a network of hidden, high-definition security cameras. The first camera showed the exterior of the ironclad storage facility. 3 black, unmarked SUVs were parked haphazardly across the wet asphalt. The second camera showed the hallway outside Unit 404. Dale, the massive facility manager, was lying face down on the linoleum, a dark pool of crimson expanding rapidly from beneath him. Chloe gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The third camera was positioned directly inside Unit 404. Standing over the closed and locked hatch were 4 men. They were dressed in flat black tactical gear without any insignia. They wore heavy plate carriers, drop-leg holsters, and carried compact, suppressed submachine guns. They moved with a chilling, synchronized efficiency. These weren't cops. They weren't FBI. They were private operators. Cleaners. The leader, a tall man with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow and cold, dead eyes, knelt by the hatch. He was inspecting the lock. He keyed a radio on his shoulder. The monitors on Harrington's desk had audio feed. The man's voice crackled through the bunker's speakers, deep and gravelly. Control, this is Silas. We have breached the primary location. The decoy was untouched, but the primary hatch has been opened. The lock cylinder is engaged from the outside now. Someone is down there. A synthesized, heavily encrypted voice replied over the radio. Status of the asset? Unknown, Silas replied, standing up and unholstering a heavy breaching charge from his vest. Assuming the asset is compromised. We are blowing the hatch and initiating a sweep. If the intruder has seen the servers, execute extreme prejudice, leave nothing alive. Copy that. Silas, proceed. Chloe's heart slammed against her ribs. Extreme prejudice. They were going to kill her. They didn't care about the money. They cared about what was on those servers. On the monitor, she watched Silas mold a block of C4 plastic explosive around the heavy iron lock cylinder of the hatch. He pressed a detonator into the clay, stepped back, and signaled his men to clear the room. 3, 2, 1. Boom. The bunker shuddered violently. Dust and loose concrete rained down from the high ceiling, coating the glass server walls in a fine gray powder. The sound of the explosion was deafening. A physical pressure wave that popped Chloe's ears and sent her stumbling into Harrington's desk. On the camera feed, the heavy steel hatch had been blown clean off its hinges, bent and twisted like tinfoil. Silas and his men immediately hooked thick nylon repelling ropes to the rusted structural pillars of the storage unit and tossed the lines down the shaft. They were coming down. Chloe had less than 30 seconds. She looked frantically around the bunker. It was massive, but it was essentially a concrete box. There was nowhere to run. She grabbed her tactical flashlight and the heavy crowbar. Her eyes darted to the bank of massive, silent lithium-ion batteries and the diesel generators. If they had night vision and looking at their gear, they absolutely did. Hiding in the dark wouldn't save her. She needed to blind them. She needed chaos. She sprinted away from the desk, moving deeper into the bunker. Past the server cube. Behind the servers, against the far wall, she spotted a heavy gray electrical panel with a massive red lever labeled Main Breaker, Emergency Override. She heard the first heavy thwack of tactical boots hitting the metal grating at the bottom of the spiral stairs. Flashlights on. Keep your angles tight. Silas's voice echoed through the cavernous room. No longer over a speaker, but cold and real. Sweep the perimeter. Find them. Chloe grabbed the heavy red lever with both hands. She waited until she heard the footsteps moving off the grating and onto the concrete floor, spreading out. She yanked the lever down. With a heavy, mechanical thunk, the blue-white glare of the monitors died. The pulsing green lights of the servers vanished. The ambient hum of the electronics spun down into terrifying silence. The bunker was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. "Power's out," one of the mercenaries barked. NVG's on. Chloe heard the distinct high-pitched whine and click of night vision goggles powering up. She knew they could see in the dark now, bathed in an eerie green glow. But she also knew a secret about night vision that her ex-boyfriend, an amateur tactical gear enthusiast, had bored her to death explaining, night vision goggles amplify ambient light thousands of times. If a sudden blinding light is introduced, the goggles will automatically shut off to protect the user's eyes, or temporarily blind them if the auto-gating fails. She crouched behind the thick steel casing of a diesel generator, gripping her high-end tactical flashlight. This wasn't a cheap plastic toy. It was a 3000 lumen strobe unit designed to disorient attackers. Footsteps approached her position. Slow, methodical, the crunch of boots on grit, closer. She could hear the man's controlled breathing. He was walking directly toward the generator she was hiding behind. Closer. He rounded the corner of the generator, the heavy barrel of his submachine gun sweeping the darkness ahead of him. Chloe lunged out from behind the steel casing, aiming the flashlight directly at the man's face, and mashed the thumb switch. A blinding, stroboscopic flash of pure white light erupted in the pitch-black room, flashing furiously at 50 times a second. The mercenary screamed, throwing his hands up to his face as the amplified light seared through his night vision goggles, effectively flashbanging his retinas. He stumbled backward, his gun firing wildly into the ceiling, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the concrete walls like lightning strikes. Before he could recover, Chloe swung the heavy iron crowbar with everything she had, aiming for the center of mass. The heavy iron connected with the man's armored chest plate with a sickening crack, driving the wind from his lungs and sending him crashing to the concrete floor. "Contact! Left flank!" Silas roared from across the room. Chloe didn't wait to see if the man was down for good. She killed the flashlight, plunging herself back into the comforting darkness, and scrambled on her hands and knees toward the narrow gap between the server cube and the back wall. "Light discipline," Silas commanded. "She's got a strobe. Switch to thermal if you have it. Pin her down." Chloe pressed her back against the cold glass of the server room, her heart hammering so hard she felt it in her teeth. She had taken one down, but there were 3 left. They were trained killers, heavily armed, and they were hunting her in a sealed box with limited oxygen. She looked at the heavy crowbar in her hand. $27. She had bought a nightmare for $27, but as she heard the slow, predatory footsteps closing in on her position, a fierce, undeniable rage began to burn through her terror. She was not going to die in the dark next to a cowardly billionaire. She had a sister to save. Chloe tightened her grip on the iron bar and waited in the pitch black. Let them come. Heavy silence pressed against Chloe's eardrums, broken only by the ragged, shallow breaths she fought to control. Crouched behind the humming, residual warmth of the massive lithium-ion battery bank, she gripped her iron crowbar with sweat-slicked palms. 3 highly trained operators from what she could only assume was a top-tier private military contractor, something akin to Constellus or the remnants of Executive Outcomes, were hunting her in a pitch-black subterranean concrete box. Briggs, Trent, fan out. Silas's voice cut through the dark, devoid of panic despite his downed man. His tone was chillingly professional, the sound of a predator organizing a pack, thermal optics online. She's small, probably hiding near the heat signatures of the generators to mask her body temp. Check your corners! Chloe's heart sank. Her ex-boyfriend's endless rants about tactical gear echoed in her mind again. Thermal imaging didn't rely on ambient light, it read body heat. Hiding in the dark was useless now. She needed to move. And she needed a barrier between herself and those suppressed submachine guns. Her eyes darted toward the center of the bunker. The glass server cube. When the power was on, she had noticed the heavy steel framing and the thick greenish tint of the glass. It wasn't just tempered, it was bullet-resistant polycarbonate. If she could get inside and lock the door, she might buy herself enough time to figure out a way out of this nightmare. She dropped to her stomach, pressing herself flat against the freezing concrete floor, and began a slow, agonizing crawl. She used the battery banks as a shield against their line of sight, inching her way toward the glass cube. Movement by the secondary array, a voice Trent barked from the far side of the room, heat signature low to the ground. They spotted her. Suppressing, Silas ordered. Thwip, thwip, thwip. A burst of silenced gunfire chewed into the concrete just inches from Chloe's boots. Shards of pulverized rock stung her calves. Panic, raw and blinding, surged through her. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning stealth, and sprinted the last 20 yards toward the glass server room. Target is mobile. Center mass. Bullets slammed into the heavy steel casing of a generator as she dove past it, the ricochets whining like angry hornets. She reached the door of the server cube. It featured a heavy biometric scanner and an old-fashioned physical keyhole. Harrington, paranoid, brilliant bastard that he was, hadn't trusted purely digital locks. Chloe jammed the heavy antique skeleton key into the slot, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. A bullet sparked against the steel doorframe, missing her shoulder by a fraction of an inch. She twisted the key, threw her weight against the heavy glass door, and spilled into the server room. Kicking the door shut behind her, she twisted the interior deadbolt just as two heavy thuds hammered against the outside of the glass. Briggs and Trent stood on the other side, their thermal-equipped night vision goggles giving them the appearance of four-eyed insects. Briggs raised his weapon and unleashed a full auto burst directly at Chloe's face. Chloe screamed, throwing her arms up. Crack, 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 crack. The bullets flattened against the thick polycarbonate, leaving spiderweb fractures in the outer layer but failing to penetrate. The glass held. Silas stepped out of the shadows, walking casually toward the cube. He pushed his night vision goggles up onto his helmet, revealing cold, gray eyes and the jagged scar traversing his brow. He pressed his hand against the damaged glass, leaning in to look at Chloe, who was backed up against a rack of silent servers, chest heaving. Polycarbonate resin. Rated for high-caliber, armor-piercing rounds, Silas muttered more to himself than to her. He tapped the glass. Smart girl, but you're in a fishbowl. Briggs, fetch the thermite charges from the SUV. We'll melt the hinges. Yes, sir, Briggs replied, jogging back toward the spiral staircase. Chloe knew thermite would eat through the steel frame in minutes. She turned away from the mercenaries and looked at the server racks. There had to be a way to fight back. She was an auditor. Her entire career was built on finding leverage in complex systems. She spotted a secondary manual override panel on the wall inside the cube. It was designed to power the servers independently from the main bunker lights. She yanked the panel open and threw the main breaker. The cube hummed to life. The green indicator lights on the server racks blinked on in rapid succession. At the back of the small room, a sleek, standalone terminal booted up, casting a harsh blue glow over her face. Chloe practically dove into the leather chair in front of the terminal. The screen displayed a complex loading sequence, lines of code scrolling faster than she could read. Finally, it settled on a stark, minimalist login screen bearing the Harrington Logistics Silver Falcon logo. It required a password. Think, Chloe. Think, she whispered, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She remembered the thick, leather-bound ledger she had pulled from the Pelican case upstairs. She frantically pulled it from her coat pocket and flipped it open. The pages were filled with coordinates and alphanumeric strings. She typed the first string of characters into the password field. Access denied. She typed the second. Access denied. Outside, Silas was watching her with grim amusement. He pulled a suppressed pistol from his drop-leg holster and aimed it at the glass, perfectly tracking her head, letting her know exactly what would happen the moment that door gave way. Chloe flipped to the last page of the ledger. There, written in bold, heavily underlined red ink, was a single phrase, not a code. Avarice is a virtue. She typed it in. Authenticating. Access granted. The screen exploded with information. Directories, nested folders, and massive databases rendered in crisp, high-definition text. Chloe's eyes darted across the screen, her financial background instantly recognizing the patterns. This wasn't a backup of Harrington Logistics corporate data. This was a shadow ledger. She clicked on a folder labeled Operation Aegis. It contained hundreds of scanned wire transfer documents, routing numbers tracing back to Credit Suisse, and offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and the Seychelles. But it was the names attached to those accounts that made her blood run cold. There were payments to sitting U.S. senators, bribes to foreign prime ministers, massive 8-figure deposits into accounts controlled by warlords in the Democratic Republic of Congo, directly tied to the acquisition of rare earth minerals used in global tech manufacturing. Richard Harrington hadn't just embezzled $2 billion. He had used it to buy the world. He was running a global extortion racket, and these servers held the undeniable, verifiable proof. What do we have here? Silas's voice suddenly crackled through the terminal's built-in speakers. He had patched into the bunker's internal comms system. Looks like you found the vault, little girl. Unfortunately for you, that data belongs to my employers. Your employers? Chloe shouted back, aiming her voice at the microphone on the desk. You mean the people Harrington was blackmailing? The politicians? The CEOs? Silas chuckled. A dry, rasping sound. You're smart, but you're not seeing the big picture. Briggs is halfway down the shaft with the thermite. You have exactly 3 minutes before I melt that door, drag you out by your hair, and put a bullet in your brain. Or you can step away from the terminal, unlock the door, and I'll make it quick. No pain. Chloe ignored him. She opened another folder. This one labeled Personal Records RH. It contained high-resolution medical files, dental records, and biometric data. She opened a subfolder containing x-rays. Her eyes narrowed. She leaned closer to the monitor, then looked out through the glass cube toward the mahogany desk where the skeletal remains of Richard Harrington lay slumped in the dark. Wait a minute, she whispered. She brought up an x-ray dated 2018. It was a lower body scan. The notes beside it, signed by a top orthopedic surgeon at Mount Sinai, detailed a catastrophic comminuted fracture of the left femur sustained during a heli-skiing accident in Gstaad, Switzerland. The bone had been completely shattered and surgically reconstructed with a massive titanium rod and 12 screws. Chloe grabbed her tactical flashlight and aimed it through the bulletproof glass, painting the skeleton slumped behind the desk with a stark beam of white light. She focused the beam on the skeleton's left leg, where the bespoke Italian trousers had rotted away. The femur was pristine, smooth, unbroken, natural bone, no titanium rod, no surgical screws. The skeleton wasn't Richard Harrington. He's alive, Chloe gasped, the realization hitting her with the force of a freight train. 3 minutes are up. Silas's voice barked over the comms. Outside the glass, Briggs had returned. He was packing a gray, clay-like substance around the heavy steel hinges of the server room door. Thermite. Once ignited, it would burn at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, slicing through the steel like warm butter. Chloe's mind raced. Harrington faked his death. He planted a decoy skeleton with a matching dental record, likely a murdered look-alike, and sealed him in the bunker. He left the $10 million in cash as a prop to make the suicide look authentic, but he couldn't take the servers with him. They were too massive, and the data was too sensitive to removing. So he hid them under an abandoned storage facility, planning to use the blackmail material remotely. And Silas didn't work for the people Harrington was blackmailing. You work for him, Chloe said into the microphone, her voice remarkably steady. You don't work for a cartel or the Russian mob. You work for Richard Harrington. Silas paused, his hand hovering over the detonator for the thermite. He looked at her through the glass, his expression unreadable. It doesn't matter who signs my checks, sweetheart. You're dead either way. If you work for Harrington, you know how paranoid he is. Chloe fired back, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She was bringing up the system architecture, looking for a specific failsafe she knew had to be there. A man this paranoid wouldn't build a shadow empire without a self-destruct sequence. Light it, Silas ordered Briggs. Briggs sparked a magnesium flare and touched it to the thermite. A blinding shower of white-hot sparks erupted from the hinges, the intense heat instantly radiating through the thick polycarbonate glass. The steel frame began to glow a violent, angry orange. Stop, Chloe screamed. Look at the screen, Silas! Look at the monitor facing you! She grabbed the terminal monitor and swiveled it around so it faced the glass door. On the screen, a massive red countdown timer had appeared, ticking down from 60 seconds. Above it, bold text read, Dead Man's Protocol Initiated. Target servers, WikiLeaks, New York Times, Interpol Command. Silas raised a hand, signaling Briggs to step back from the burning door. What did you do? He demanded, his professional calm finally cracking. It's a dead man's switch, Chloe lied, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had found a scheduled backup protocol and simply relabeled the UI, but Silas didn't know that. Harrington built a failsafe. If this terminal is breached, or if I hit the execute key, every single file on this server is instantly broadcast to every major news outlet and intelligence agency on the planet. The steel hinges of the door were beginning to sag, molten metal dripping onto the concrete floor like glowing tears. You're bluffing, Silas snarled. You're a scavenger who got lucky at an auction. You don't know how to override a Tier 1 secure server. I was a senior forensic auditor for Grant Thornton. Chloe shot back, her voice ringing with absolute authority. I spent 5 years dismantling corporate firewalls to find hidden assets. I know exactly what I'm looking at. 45 seconds, Silas. When that timer hits 0, Harrington's empire burns. And when he finds out you were the one who let it happen, what do you think he'll do to you? Silas stared at the glowing red timer on the screen. 38 seconds. 37. He looked at the melting door, then back to Chloe, realizing the absolute terrifying truth. She held all the cards. The violent, angry orange glow of the melting steel framed Silas's face like a portrait of pure rage. For an agonizing second, the mercenary leader weighed his options. The thermite hissed, spitting white-hot sparks against the polycarbonate glass. The timer on the screen ticked relentlessly downward. 22 seconds. "Put it out!" Silas roared, his voice cracking with unprecedented panic. "Briggs, kill the burn! Now!" Briggs scrambled forward, ripping a heavy, specialized fire-retardant blanket from his tactical vest and smothering the hinges. The thermite sputtered, fought against the chemical retardant, and finally choked out in a cloud of acrid, gray smoke. Through the spiderwebbed glass, Chloe let out a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to interlock her fingers to keep them steady over the keyboard. She had won the standoff, but she was still trapped in a glass cage 50 feet underground with 3 heavily armed killers. "All right, sweetheart," Silas breathed heavily, staring through the scorched glass. "You bought yourself a stalemate, but you can't stay in there forever. There's no food, no water, and eventually, that terminal is going to require a rolling cipher authorization from a biometric key you don't possess. So, let's talk business." Chloe didn't answer him immediately. Her eyes were frantically scanning the system architecture displayed on the secondary monitor. If this was a self-sustaining fallout shelter, it had to have environmental controls. And more importantly, it had to have an emergency egress. Billionaires like Richard Harrington didn't build tombs. They built escape pods. She opened the environmental and schematics directory. A 3D wireframe model of the bunker rendered on the screen. "I'm offering you a way out," Silas continued, his tone shifting from predatory to persuasive. "You're clearly resourceful. Harrington appreciates resourceful people. You walk out of there, hand over the localized backups, and I'll let you take one of those canvas bags. $2 million, tax-free. You walk away, your sister gets her bone marrow transplant at Johns Hopkins, and everyone goes home happy." Chloe froze. He knew about her sister. "You think we didn't run your face through facial recognition the second you walked into that storage unit?" Silas sneered, tapping his temple. "Chloe Bennett. Former auditor. Bankrupt. Desperate. We know exactly who you are. Take the money, Chloe." It was a tempting lie. $2 million would solve every problem she had. But Silas was a cleaner. Cleaners didn't leave witnesses who had seen the faces of sitting senators on a shadow ledger. The moment she opened that door, she would join the decoy skeleton on the floor. Her eyes caught a flashing icon on the bunker schematic. Secondary maintenance egress. It was located directly behind the server racks in the cube she was currently occupying, leading up to the municipal storm drain system. But she needed a distraction to get the heavy steel panel open. She looked back at the environmental controls. The bunker was equipped with a state-of-the-art fire suppression system meant to protect the servers. "I need a guarantee," Chloe called out, her voice loud enough to carry through the glass. She dragged a window across the screen, highlighting the fire suppression controls. "I'll toss my weapon onto the floor," Silas offered, unholstering his sidearm and dropping it onto the concrete. "See? I'm reasonable." "You're lying," Chloe said. She selected the entire main chamber of the bunker on the schematic and armed the fire suppression system. "What are you doing?" Silas demanded, noticing her reflection on the glass shifting abruptly. "Taking my own guarantee." Chloe slammed the enter key. Instantly, a deafening, mechanical siren blared through the subterranean chamber. Strobe lights mounted on the concrete pillars began flashing violently in red and white. Over the loudspeakers, a calm, automated voice echoed. "Warning. Fire suppression system activated. Halon gas deployment in 10 seconds. Evacuate main chamber immediately." Silas's eyes widened in sheer terror. Halon gas didn't just extinguish fires, it rapidly displaced oxygen. It was lethal to humans in an enclosed space without breathing apparatuses. "Breach the glass!" Silas screamed, scrambling for the dropped pistol. "Shoot the glass!" Briggs and Trent opened fire, pouring automatic fire into the polycarbonate cube. The glass spiderwebbed further, groaning under the kinetic impact, but the thick resin held. 5, 4, 3, 5. The automated voice droned. "We have to go!" Trent yelled, grabbing Silas by the shoulder plate and dragging him toward the spiral staircase. "We'll suffocate!" 2, 1. Deployment. Massive vents in the ceiling hissed, and a thick, heavy white cloud began pouring into the chamber, instantly blanketing the room. Chloe watched through the fractured glass as the three mercenaries abandoned their assault, sprinting blindly through the fog toward the stairs, coughing violently as the gas began to rob their lungs of air. Chloe didn't waste a second. She grabbed a small, encrypted solid-state drive from the desk, plugged it into the terminal, and initiated a rapid download of the Operation Aegis folder. She shoved the drive into her coat pocket, grabbed her heavy tactical flashlight, and squeezed behind the humming server racks. There it was. A heavy steel maintenance hatch set into the concrete wall. She threw the latch and hauled it open, revealing a dark, narrow ladder stretching straight up into the gloom. The climb was agonizing, a brutal test of endurance that pushed Chloe's exhausted body past its absolute limits. Every rung of the rusted iron ladder felt like a blade biting into her blistered palms. Her shoulders burned, her thighs trembled, and her lungs desperately pulled at the freezing, damp air of the narrow maintenance shaft. The concrete walls pressed in tightly around her, thick with the smell of river mud, ancient mildew, and the metallic tang of old rainwater. Far below her, muffled by layers of heavy steel and reinforced concrete, she could hear the chaotic, desperate symphony of her pursuers. The faint, distant sounds of violent coughing echoed up the shaft, punctuated by the panicked, erratic scraping of tactical boots slipping on metal. Silas and his men were trapped in the lower stairwell, fighting a losing battle against the heavy, oxygen-displacing Halen gas and the ruined steel hatch they had so arrogantly blown off its hinges. Chloe didn't look down. She couldn't afford a single second of hesitation, driven upward by the primal, blinding instinct to survive. After what felt like an eternity in the dark, her head abruptly cracked against a solid, unyielding surface, a heavy cast iron grate. Ice-cold rainwater trickled down through the narrow slots, splashing against her bruised face and mixing with her sweat. She pressed her hands flat against the underside of the heavy iron, braced her boots against the slippery rungs below her, and shoved upward with every ounce of strength she had left. The grate groaned, the rusted edges grinding harshly against the pavement before finally giving way. Chloe hauled herself out of the suffocating hole, collapsing onto the wet, rain-slicked asphalt of a dark alleyway. She rolled onto her back, gasping for air as the freezing Chicago rain washed the dust, grime, and terror from her skin. She was lying behind an abandoned, graffiti-covered textile factory, at least a mile away from the ironclad storage facility. The city loomed above her, loud and magnificently indifferent. The distant wail of a police siren, the hum of traffic, and the bleeding neon lights reflecting in the puddles felt like an absolute miracle. With trembling, numb fingers, she reached into her soaked trench coat pocket. She brushed against the cold, hard edges of the encrypted solid-state drive. Then, nestled beneath it, she felt the thick, tightly banded stack of $100 bills she had instinctively shoved into her pocket when she first opened the canvas bags. She pulled it out, staring at the wet paper in the dim light. It was only $10,000, a minuscule fraction of the millions left behind to rot in the dark, but to her, it was a lifeline. 2 weeks later, the global financial markets experienced a seismic, devastating shock. Working systematically from a series of public libraries and cash-bought burner laptops, Chloe had applied the same meticulous, cold precision she used as an auditor to anonymously distribute the encrypted files. The data drop, quickly dubbed the Harrington Ledgers by the frantic media, was delivered simultaneously to the Cybercrimes Division of Interpol in Lyon, France, and the editorial boards of the New York Times and Der Spiegel. It contained undeniable, verifiable proof of a massive global extortion and bribery ring orchestrated by a man the world firmly believed was dead. The fallout was instantaneous. Within 48 hours, 3 sitting U.S. senators resigned in disgrace, their assets frozen by federal authorities. The CEO of a major Swiss defense contractor, directly tied to illegal arms shipments via the offshore shell accounts, was dragged from his Geneva villa in handcuffs. An unprecedented international manhunt, utilizing the world's most advanced intelligence networks, was immediately launched to find Richard Harrington. Chloe watched the breaking news chyron scroll across the television from the corner of a comfortable, sunlit private room at the University of Chicago Medical Center. The $10,000 she had pulled from the bunker had been just enough to bypass the insurance bureaucracy, securing an emergency private consultation and covering the initial deductibles for her sister Sarah's specialized treatment plan. Chloe looked away from the television, her gaze settling on the hospital bed. For the first time in 6 agonizing months, Sarah had color in her cheeks. The new experimental trial had been approved, and the steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the room with a sense of profound peace. Somewhere out there in the world, Silas and his crew were either dead in a sealed concrete tomb or on the run, hunted relentlessly by the very syndicates they used to protect. And Richard Harrington, the arrogant puppet master who thought he could control the globe from the shadows, was now a ghost with a global target on his back, nowhere left to hide. Chloe smiled softly, leaning back in her chair. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers tracing the heavy, cold outline of the antique iron skeleton key. She had kept it as a quiet reminder. $27. It was the most terrifying gamble of her life and the best investment she had ever made. Chloe's harrowing descent into the buried sins of a billionaire began with a desperate gamble and ended with a global reckoning. The $27 she spent on Unit 404 didn't just buy her a pile of rusted pipes, it bought her the power to dismantle an empire of corruption. While she left the millions in cash to rot in the dark, she extracted something far more valuable: the truth, the means to save her sister's life, and a profound realization of her own unyielding resilience. In the end, Richard Harrington believed his wealth and paranoia made him a god, but it was the quiet desperation of a forgotten woman that brought his world crashing down. The shadows he built to protect himself ultimately became the perfect place for his secrets to be exposed to the light.